Evening. Welcome back to the Laurier Milton Lecture Series with the Milton Public Library. This is our last lecture of 2020. I have to say that these monthly lectures have been a bright spot during a really challenging year. So thank you so much for joining us. As usual, I hope you're comfortable. I hope you have a snack or a beverage or both. You have been muted on entry, and we do ask that you stay that way with your videos turned off after the intro is done. If you do have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. And we do have time carved out for questions. I know that's been a favorite part of these lectures. The lecture is being recorded, and it will be shared in a couple of days with all of you. My name is Carolyn Hawthorne, and I work for Wilfrid Laurier University. I am so proud of this partnership with the Milton Public Library. The Laurier Milton Lecture Series provides a wonderful opportunity to engage in public dialogue with the citizens of Milton and, of course, beyond in this virtual world on a broad array of important topics. Presentations represent the current research and analysis from different faculties, departments, and programs at Laurier. We will be back in 2021. We'll be back on January the 13th. New year, new topic, designing a better world, one experience at a time with Adi Goodrum, professor and program coordinator, user experience design. Before we begin the program, we would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldeman Tract, the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples and symbolize the agreement to share and protect our resources and not engage in conflict. The treaty was signed by the British with our allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, these nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory after losing much of the territory to settlement of newcomers. Perhaps you're joining us from another location tonight. If that's the case, I would encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the land where you reside. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the land and water. This evening, I am so excited to introduce our speaker. Lianne Leddy is a member of the Serpent River First Nation and was born and raised in Elliott Lake, Ontario. She's an associate professor of Indigenous Studies in Laurier's Faculty of Liberal Arts. While completing her PhD at Laurier, she taught courses in Indigenous and Canadian history in the Department of Humanities at Mount Royal University in Calgary, and also worked as an academic advisor in the Faculty of Arts. Prior to joining Laurier as a faculty member in 2014, Lianne was an assistant professor in the Department of History at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Her research focuses on Indigenous settler relations, particularly those framed by gender and environmental issues. Lianne is also interested in Indigenous methodologies and decolonizing research practices. Lianne has received several awards, including 2 merit awards at Laurier in 2016 and 2018, and the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations Status of Women and Equity Award of Distinction in 2018. We're very excited and honored to have you here, Lianne. Welcome and thank you.
Miigwech, Carolyn, for such a generous introduction. That was lovely. Ani Bojo, Lianne Leddy, and Dishnakaz, Wabshishina Dadam, Ganad Bijang Donjaba, Waterloo, and Diane. Greetings and miigwech for hosting me for the Milton Lecture Series tonight. I wanted to note also that the Halton region is rich in the history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis, from the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis. These lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history, and Milton is the city of Milton is also part of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation territory, and is part of the, I hope I'm saying this right, Adjutance Treaty, number 19 from 1818. I come to you from Waterloo this evening in this digital world, which, as Carolyn mentioned, is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty area and is on the Haldeman Tract, 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, promised to the Haudenosaunee after the American War of Independence. It's also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Neutral people, and is home to an Indigenous community today. So before we get too far into the actual research tonight, and thank you all for joining me, I wanted to locate myself and also have a note on terminology. As Carolyn mentioned, I am a member of Ganabajing, or Serpent River First Nation, and I grew up in Elliott Lake, which is situated on our traditional territory on the North Shore. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but if you can, it's just to the east of Sault Ste. Marie on the North Shore of Lake Huron. It's part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Area in that location on the North Shore. And I also want to note, before we get started, you'll note that in the title, I have the word Indian to refer to the Indian Homemakers Club. I will use that word to refer to the historical Homemakers Club itself, or in reference to the Indian Act or Indian Affairs, but the term itself is a misnomer, so I want to make that clear. I will only use it to refer to specific titles, to legal terms, or in two specific cases from direct historical quotations. You'll note that otherwise, I refer specifically to the Anishinaabe, or where more appropriate, in a general sense, I will use the term Indigenous. I'm stating this from the outset because it does sound jarring, and I want to be clear that it is not the proper terminology to use today when referring to Indigenous peoples or to specific nations. During my talk this evening, I want to share what I've learned in my historical research about Indigenous women's activism in the face of continued colonial interference. I want to emphasize that this interference is not just historical in nature, but is ongoing today. And to this end, I want to take some time tonight to tell you 3 stories highlighting Indigenous women's activism from the 1950s to the present day. And I define activism, as you'll see, very, very broadly. That can refer to direct action, to proclaiming and maintaining Indigenous women's identities and responsibilities in the face of sexist and colonial oppression, or in my case, working to reclaim those traditions and asserting our histories in the face of contemporary commemorative celebrations through performance art. My argument today is that Indigenous women's resistance is community-based, forward-looking, and powerful in the face of colonial oppression. I want to highlight the strength of Indigenous women as we have long worked against colonial policies and practices, even if those efforts were not widely known outside of our communities. And sometimes this work was done in subversive ways, sometimes in overt ways, and increasingly in very public ways. In all, Indigenous women have demonstrated what the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples have called a particular genius for survival. So tonight, I want to explore our history of activism through these 3 stories from my own history that also reflect as well my research journey. The first is through the Indian Homemakers Club. While many reserve communities in Ontario formed homemaking groups to encourage domestic and charitable pursuits, Anishinaabe Kwewak women took leadership roles in Indian homemakers clubs and made them their own, focusing their efforts on issues that they deemed to be important. These clubs were not solely tools of colonialism because they were started by Indian Affairs, but rather they turned into ways that Indigenous women used to work towards decolonization in unexpected ways. The second story, in that second story, I will examine Anishinaabe Kwewak resistance to land and water pollution as a result of uranium mining on our territory. This is a story that I came to as a child, listening or eavesdropping, as the case may be, at my grandmother's house. And it became a larger story that I researched for my PhD dissertation, incorporating archival and newspaper research, but still at my grandmother's kitchen table, where I interviewed her and others at theirs, who were generous enough to share their knowledge with me. When the impacts of uranium mining on the Serpent River watershed became more clearly communicated to the community, Anishinaabe women, including my grandmother, some of whom held chief and council roles, spoke out against potential expansion of mining operations and about the contamination of reserve land by an acid plant that operated during the same time period. And then in the third and final section, I want to share storytelling in a slightly different way, a new research method for me as an historian. In response to Canada's sesquicentennial celebrations, Drs. Kim Anderson, Brittany Luby, and myself created the Jikigay Historical Society, As 3 Indigenous women with PhDs in history, we have sought to shed light on Indigenous, especially Indigenous women's perspectives on Canadian history. And I'll take you through our Grannies of Confederation performance and our latest performance done for the Aramosa and Speed Rivers in Guelph. So I'll turn now to our first story, the Indian Homemakers clubs. And I want to provide a brief overview of the clubs themselves. I came to this story while I was researching my dissertation. It was one of those moments at an archive that an historian loves. I found this file at Library and Archives Canada, sitting in the quiet reading room overlooking the Ottawa River on unceded Algonquin territory. And I had so many questions after reading the document, the file. And sadly, because it was outside of the scope of my dissertation and I was already taking way too long to write it, I had to put that down for another time. And that time came as soon as that dissertation was filed. And so in this project here, I primarily consulted archival records and also interviewed elders as part of a larger look at community life in the 1950s and 1960s. And so part of that was looking at oral history as well as archival history. The club itself was first established in 1937 in Saskatchewan by Thomas Robertson. And clubs were really encouraged by the Department of Indian Affairs, or the Indian Affairs branch, to encourage domestic pursuits amongst Indigenous women on reserves. And so to that end, clubs were provided a sewing machine and $50 worth of sewing notions. At the time, Indian Affairs, at the time that I'm looking at, the 1950s and 60s, Indian Affairs fell under the Department of Citizenship and Immigration. So this is between 1950 and 1965. And you can think about a lot of these policies and initiatives were designed to Canadianize Indigenous peoples, just as they sought to Canadianize New Canadians. And we can see that there's a similar trajectory for both groups of people. And I also want to note too that this is a time of these 1950s ideals about separate spheres, so women at home, men going off to work, a leave it to beaver kind of existence that excluded Indigenous women, certainly for the purposes of this research project, but also excluded a lot of racialized women, New Canadians, as well as working people. But to move back to the club itself reinforced traditional community and kinship social support practices and allowed women to exert their Indigenous gender roles, even though that was not the intent from Indian Affairs perspective. So in fact, they used community organizations like this to subvert the post-war feminine ideal and the colonial influences of the department. Some even reinforced their own political and social status in First Nations communities through their involvement in the club as well. And so the goal of the club, as I want to mention from a lot of the documentary evidence, that sort of the tagline was, quote, to improve living conditions in Indian communities by cooperating in all projects which have as their objective a better life. And oftentimes, end quote, and oftentimes that better life was defined as part of the Indian Affairs branch's integration strategies or assimilation strategies. And so when Indigenous women actually turn that around for themselves to define and reinforce what was a better life for them, sometimes that was unexpected. And I also found it interesting to look at the logo. This is the logo for the Homemakers Club. It features what you can probably see is an imagined depiction of what the Indian Affairs branch thought was some sort of maiden or princess. You can see the headband with the single feather out the back. And she also seems to have what appear to be white features as well. And the motto for home and country, I want to also stress, belies the disenfranchisement of Anishinaabe women federally and locally, as First Nations with Indian status, those registered under the Indian Act, could not vote in federal elections until 1960, nor could they participate in band elections at the community level until the 1951 revisions of the Indian Act. So for home and country seems to me to be quite an odd statement on the face of this. But even so, the organization, as conceived by the federal government, placed Indigenous women at the forefront of service for a community and a country that excluded their political participation in its most basic form. And the Constitution here is also just to demonstrate what that looks like. This is actually the front cover of the Constitution. And when it came to the club itself and the running of the organization, the documentary evidence suggests that the department expected women to adopt the framework and meeting rules laid out by this Constitution. So as you can imagine, it has a very kind of Robert's Rules type meeting structure that was the expectation for these meetings. At the time, the Indian superintendent, the civil servant for Indian Affairs, commented hopefully on the ability of women of the Shawanaga Homemakers Club, for instance, to adopt a Western meeting and service practices, which would be in accordance with the Constitution. And as he wrote, while progress has been rather slow, we believe that through time, their standards of procedure and their work on the reserve will show much improvement. So you can see that this concern for procedural rules of order, evident in the Constitution and in Indian Affairs branch correspondence, was an attempt to impose a kind of civilizing model that contained a very strict speaking and motions policy. And as such, it was inconsistent with Anishinaabe protocols and political and diplomatic protocols, which had been developed over centuries. And further, as you might imagine, the women who joined the clubs were less interested and concerned with procedure than the actual work that needed to be done. Indeed, one handwritten report from the Saugeen Homemakers Club listed their activities, which included sewing work, fundraising, and organizing social evenings, as well as planting a garden for food. The report's author included one telling line about the nature of their meetings, highlighting the differences between the department and Anishinaabe protocols. So she wrote, quote, so far we have had 14 meetings, mostly just as a social gathering, end quote. These women had clearly been busy in the community reestablishing their club, raising funds, securing food, but they did not see the need to formalize their meetings in such a way as to slow down their work, which was tied to kinship, visiting, and their other responsibilities to community and family. So in other words, service work and social protocols were not distinct entities, but rather part of a comprehensive community role that did not necessitate the department's definition of formalized meeting rules and regulations. And while the club members may have adopted its constitution, its logo, and the name, and they recorded the rules of the meeting that this happened with, they concentrated on the work that needed to be done. So in other words, they did the work and proved unwilling to have their meetings shaped by departmental procedure. I also want to note for people the way that Indigenous communities and parenting structures were constructed by Indian Affairs and continue to be, in my opinion, constructed by Canada. We can see that there are references to petty jealousies and what was deemed to be, dangerous parenting. And how I sort of managed to get at this was that every year there was a Homemakers Club convention where delegates would gather. And each year then there was a report based on that convention. So the events associated with the convention typically involved the local chief, as well as the three arms of colonial policy, the Indian agent or a representative from Indian Affairs, a priest, and a social worker. In this case, it was Mrs. Helen Martins. And the schedule of events included activities, crafts, films, roundtables, but also speeches from these various authority figures. Women in attendance would be lectured on the importance of good housekeeping skills, of family budgets, and of course, good mothering. In the summary report of the convention, Ms. Martins always includes an opening note. In her 1959 report, she wrote, quote, above all, let us not let petty jealousies interfere with meetings and good work. We are trying to get an overall job done that will benefit everyone in the community, regardless of likes or dislikes. So here we can see that she's constructing communities as being dysfunctional, as not having the tools to be able to problem solve and resolve differences, which of course we had and continue to have. Play, children's play, was another concern of the social worker. And in 1957, club members were asked to remember the importance of play for children. And this really struck me because it's a troubling quotation, to be sure, but it also, I'm not sure how this was observed at all. So I'll read you the quote. The reason why so many men and women do drink and get into trouble is because they never learned how to play when they were young. They never learned how to enjoy themselves and have a good time. Ms. Martins goes on to describe the dangers of substance abuse, particularly seeing alcohol as, quote, a very poor substitute. It causes parents to neglect themselves and their children. If nothing can be done about such conditions, the children are either sent to residential school or grow up like their parents, ignorant of making a living and of properly raising their families, end quote. So this construction of Indigenous parenthood as being dangerous is something that came up in here. And you can see shade, this is very overt, obviously, as a quotation, but you can see it also in terms of the lessons that women were being taught that had to do with mothering, that they were very much seen as mothers of the nation. And of course, it was their responsibility if things didn't go well. I also want to note too that the threat, if nothing can be done about such conditions, the children are either sent to residential school or grow up like their parents. This is a very, very real threat. And the negative consequences of what was deemed to be Indigenous parenting were clear, and the state took measures to counter that. So hopefully we are aware of the generations of children that had already been removed to residential schools, and the 60s scoop, which was already beginning to be underway in the late 1950s. These threatened community cohesion anew. So this was not an idle sort of threat that was placed in this document talking about the convention. This was something that was tearing families and communities apart. The participants were clearly being called upon as mothers of the nation to keep their children and by extension their communities out of trouble. And at the same time, Indigenous motherhood was targeted as dangerous without the outside influence of the department and its social workers. And I want to stress also that clearly the problem was not so simple as an absence of play in Indigenous childhoods. In fact, many groups in Ontario had already been fostering sports and leisure amongst their youth. I can think of lacrosse as the creator's game, common in many of our communities across Turtle Island. But then also my reserve, Serpent River First Nation, while not located in Southern Ontario where this convention took place, supported sports teams that had been long established, and the community had already built a playground and a hockey rink. Indigenous communities had these games, whether they were Indigenous games or Western games as well. And such activities were oftentimes central to children's upbringing. So in other words, the notion that children should play was not a new concept to Indigenous peoples, but rather one that became, I think, more formalized by social workers, government officials, and urban planners in a post-war context. And so the ways that Indigenous women worked within the club and subverted a lot of the ideals that came with it, we can see broken into, I saw patterns of elder care, of creating safe spaces for children, and fundraising. So when it came to elder care, we can see examples when Indigenous women noted that Indian Affairs or their own councils would not pay for extra care for elders or people with disabilities. And their efforts then supplemented this wellness work and indicates an important responsibility that Anishinaabe took seriously. So a report from the Shawanaga Homemakers Club, so again, that club that the superintendent hoped would start to get on with their business, the report from 1954 noted that they had gathered a secondhand cook stove, a bed, spring, and mattress, some curtains and other odds and ends to help make an old widower's house a little more home-like. The members cleaned his house and put things in order for him. And then another woman, Mary Jane Simpson, wrote in 1961 that an indigent man who did not have a relative in the world, he lived in a small house alone and then he went blind, and the council never paid any attention, nor would they pay him 1 cent. So I'm trying to do a little welfare work as I see the need. And so we can see women then inserting themselves into this care, which would have been something that would have been their responsibilities anyway, but using the Homemakers Club to make it, I think, a little bit more safe for this kind of work that they were doing, this community work. At that, see, you asked us to start this Homemakers Club, and so now we're going to point out how you're not actually funding our people properly, and we have to step in. We can also see in safe spaces for children, this was another way that women subverted the original intent of the club. And I see it as an incredibly important part of their work, as the women did too, judging from the records they left. Mrs. Agnes Milosiki wrote to the Superintendent O'Neill in 1956, quote, "Some time ago last fall, the Homemakers Club asked, and it was granted by the Indian Affairs Branch, for $200 for the repairs to the clubhouse. The resolution was signed according to one of the councillors, but I never knew whether it had been sent. The resolution was signed between January and March, as the chief was told the money had been spent before the end of March. Then again, from different sources, the chief did not want the clubhouse fixed, as we were getting a basement in our church for social purposes." So here we can see Mrs. Milosiki actually writing directly to Indian Affairs over her band council to find out where this resolution was. Did they get the money? Because she wanted to make sure that they got the clubhouse. They didn't want to be put in the basement of the church. They wanted their own clubhouse fixed. And so she's actually circumventing some of even her own community politics to be able to do that. And we can also see that my community hired a playground supervisor, while Perry Island First Nations Club was provided some space on the shoreline to assist with fundraising events. And so we can see again the securing of space for the Homemakers Club, and also for girls in particular, was something that women found important enough that they actually they used the club for those ends. And then when it came to fundraising, again, and this goes back to this idea of play, when my own community tried to ask Indian Affairs for the funds for baseball equipment, the Indian agent tried to block the request, saying that they would take better care of the materials if they had to buy it themselves. And so a band council resolution had been passed in April 1955 that requested, it was very specific, $146.65 in band funds for baseball equipment and $50 to repair the ballpark. The Indian agent superintendent wrote the regional supervisor and stated that they should get the equipment some other way, but that he was willing to, quote, give consideration to the $50 request. So in response to such a request in 1955, F. Matters, the regional supervisor of Indian Affairs agencies, responded, quote, "With regard to equipment, the last time I was at Serpent River, I told some of those who were interested that the ball club should find some way to provide their own equipment, and that the branch did not think it advisable to use band funds for this purpose. If they work to acquire the equipment, they will take far greater care of it." And so this demonstrates how community funds were monitored. I want to make it clear also, this was community money that they had themselves, but they had to ask permission of Indian Affairs to use it for this purpose because of the Indian Act and the way that they had veto power over this kind of use of money. And so it demonstrates how these funds were monitored by Indian Affairs, but it also demonstrates the power of Indian Affairs representatives still had, despite these band council resolutions. So what I mean to say is that Matters had the power to suggest that they be overturned, since all information and resolutions were filtered through him. So how these documents work when you're going through them at Library and Archives Canada is you have a band council resolution that gets sent back to Ottawa, but it has a cover letter from the Indian agent or the local superintendent to be able to then frame that for Ottawa in whatever way he would see fit. So it demonstrates the paternalistic nature of this relationship as well. This has echoes of a parent saying, well, if you buy your own cell phone, you might take better care of it. This is how chiefs and councils were treated. So the women, of course, stepped up and had picnic lunches and other types of fundraisers to ensure that the children had baseball equipment. When I interviewed Elder Frank Lewis, I asked him about the Homemakers Club. I'd asked him general questions about youth in the community, but I also asked him about the Homemakers Club. And he said, quote, "Yeah, and they had the Women's League, and another thing too, the Women's League, what they did was we had a baseball team and it cost us money. Baseballs, you got to buy baseballs, you got to buy ball bats, you got to buy shin guards, you got to buy, equipment. And what they used to do was they used to participate in box socials, as they call them. You'd make a box and you put lunch in there and you raffle them off at night. And then that's how they made their money." And so I think it's more to my point. I'm not sure if he remembered whether this was the Women's League or whether this was the Homemakers Club, or what group this was. But I think that's more to my point, that he remembers women in the community doing this fundraiser at what would have been the same time in the mid 1950s. And although he couldn't recall if this was a formalized club, Frank remembered, and quote, "What I remember mostly is women used to come at home and they used to make blankets and little square jobs, and they used to cut them up, and all the women there, that's what they used to do at night too." I don't know if it was a club or if that was just what they did. And again, that's more to my point, that that the women used the club for their ends, or they disregarded it and did the work that they needed to do as it was. So to conclude this part of the story, the Homemakers Club in Ontario, although instigated and strongly encouraged by the Department of Citizenship and Immigration, was also an organization used by Indigenous women for their own purposes, whether it was reinforcing traditional kinship and generational roles, community fundraising, or securing space for themselves. It is clear that they were not simply reinforcing dominant post-war gender norms. Members of the Indian Homemakers Clubs did not just meet mostly as a social gathering, but rather they were finding their own ways to serve home and country when they were either new to or completely excluded from overt political participation. And I wanted to move now to the second story, and just point out that this is a photo of the Serpent River from the bridge on the Trans-Canada Highway between the reserve and the settler village, Serpent River. And this is an important story for me, not just because it was the first I ever researched as an historian, but because mostly it tied together all of my family history. So I mentioned that I was from Elliott Lake, which some of you might recognize as a former uranium mining town, and it's now a retirement community. The local history and the elders I interviewed make it clear that Anishinaabeg had long used this area for hunting and trapping. But when the Cold War brought demand for uranium for nuclear weapons development, Canada entered into a contract with the United States to meet their demand for uranium. And thus the town of Elliott Lake was established as a settler mining town in the mid 1950s. So personally, as the daughter of an Irish Canadian miner, and my father himself is from a mining family, and an Anishinaabe, this was a story that involved both sides of my family. My grandmother, Gertrude Lewis, had a long history of community involvement in the face of mining and the acid plant, and she shared this knowledge with me from a young age. And so this is a map of the Serpent River watershed of the uranium tailings areas. The light gray is the watershed here. You can see the lake, or the Serpent River watershed moving into the north shore of Lake Huron. And these other lakes and rivers as part of the watershed as well. The dark black are the urban areas, so Elliott Lake, Serpent River, Sprague, and the First Nation is in here with the village sort of around this area. And the sort of tailings areas are this in-between color here. So you can see a lot of these tailings management areas all through the watershed here. And this is what they did with the uranium tailings. So as I mentioned, mines were established in Elliott Lake in the North Shore area. But even in the early days, local newspapers indicated that there was going to be a tremendous waste disposal problem here. And concerns about water quality are evident in government documents, as well as in coverage in the Globe and Mail in the 1960s. And the impacts that tailings leakage had on the watershed were significant for the river itself and also the beings that relied on it. Elders spoke about the impacts on fishing as well as beaver quality. And importantly, some community members still drew drinking water from the river and hunted and entrapped animals that did so as well. But I have not found evidence that the Serpent River First Nation community was directly told about these dangers before the mid 1970s. So this is 20 years after mining began. And my grandmother, by the 1970s, when I did this research for my dissertation, she had told me about going up with another woman with the community during this time period in the 70s to tour what she termed the dead lakes. And she mentioned, quote, when they were talking about the expansion, because we toured one of the sites and, oh, it was terrible there. And the smell, and there was a little lake there and it was a dead lake. And at that time, there were 10 dead lakes around Elliott Lake and it was in the paper. And so that was one of the dead lakes that we were at. And the animals would be piled so high around the lake, all dead from this lake. probably drinking a little bit of water that was in it, and the Ministry of the Environment noticed that there were no sprinkler systems working. Like the mine should have had a sprinkler system working, and they didn't. And when we got there, the Ministry of the Environment, boy, did they ever run around to turn on the sprinkler system. And then we had noticed all those dead animals around there, rabbits and all kinds of dead animals, but we couldn't see them all because they were all around the back of the lake. And we told them, the Ministry of the Environment, that we were traveling with them, by the way. We were in their car, which didn't look good, I guess, to the mines. They got their men to pick up some of those dead animals, and they wanted to take them back for analysis. We never got the results of that. And the head fellow for the Ministry of the Environment, that he was traveling with them that day, he never came back here again. That was his last meeting. And he was never allowed to come back again. Next time they had another meeting up there, it was a young fellow. And oh, was he ever miserable with us. He sure didn't want to talk to us at all. And he didn't even want to take us on that tour. We toured the mines that time and they didn't want to take us. And they said we couldn't go. And it was the head of the union in Elliott Lake. And he said, no, let the women go. So they allowed us to go. And so, end quote. So tellingly, I think she surmised, quote, it seemed like they were kind of afraid of us because we were noticing everything, end quote. And when there was talk of expanding the mines in the late 1970s, members of the Environmental Assessment Board were invited into the community. And Gertrude recalled, quote, we brought those guys down here from the panel to see the destruction around here. And we had a lunch for them at the band hall, and they wouldn't drink tea or coffee. End quote. When further attempts to offer hospitality were met with hesitation, SRFN members assured their guests that, quote, it was not water from Elliott Lake, you know, end quote. As she and Lorena Lewis, who was our first female chief, attended these Environmental Assessment Board hearings with other concerned community members, she said, quote, you could see them looking at us when we walked in. Oh, here they come again. And so the tailings damage to the watershed was also accompanied by the establishment of an acid plant. In 1955-56, Noranda Mines built the acid plant in the reserve community itself. Sulfuric acid was used in the leaching process to extract the uranium from the rock in this roster plant. The plant, of course, had promised jobs for community members, and the site was chosen in part because it was close to transportation infrastructure. Another reason was that the federal government could use an old lease for a timber mill that had never been fully returned to the community years before as a rationale for entering into the lease agreement with Noranda. Furthermore, some community members had wanted their own legal representation at the time of the lease, but elders who were interviewed about this said the request was denied by Indian Affairs. Elders I interviewed talked about the harsh working conditions in the plant, as well as the damage that it did to the air for the surrounding area, resulting in deforestation and damage to houses. Terry Jacobs, who worked in the plant, an elder in the community, described difficulty breathing. There were times you couldn't wear the gas masks in there, he said. The diaphragms would freeze up and you'd choke yourself. You didn't get anything else. My grandmother talked about my grandfather's experience as a worker in the plant, and she said, quote, and then his clothes were always burned. Almost every week he had to buy new clothes for work because they had little holes in them, burned. I guess it depended on where you were working in the plant too, you know, if you were working right there where the fumes were and everything, and he was just worked on labor, and that was dirty. Working right in, you know, where all the dirt was and everything, and he got burned on his face with some of the acid, end quote. So these are the experiences of some of the Indigenous workers in this plant. And some elders also mentioned having to fish further out because of the pollution, in addition to their children developing skin rashes after swimming in the area. Terry Jacobs told me about his child's experience swimming, and he said, quote, all the leaching from the acid plant went into the bay and it contaminated all the shorelines. Our daughter would go swimming and she'd come out with all a rash, and most of the kids did, end quote. And in an effort to avoid these rashes for children, my grandmother, Gertrude Lewis, remembers mistakenly thinking that the river was a safer place for leisure activities than near the acid plant. And as she told me, quote, we thought the water was so dirty down here in the bay and they were breaking out, you know, they would get sores on them. So instead of swimming there, they went up to the Serpent River, and the Serpent River was nice and clear. And we thought, oh, they're safe up there. And that's, and here we found there's radium-226 in that river. We weren't supposed to use that water at all, end quote. When the acid plant closed, the company left a mess. The cleanup phase took place in two parts, and the first was during a training operation called Exercise Powder Serpent in the summer of 1969, which was designed as a training exercise for the Department of National Defense. But what that did was it ended up blowing materials over a much larger surface area than it had been already. And the subsequent cleanup in 1988 came after long negotiations on the part of Serpent River leadership, which included Chief Earl Commanda, Keith Lewis, and other active community members. And it took threats of blocking the highway and trains and moving some of the waste from the acid plant to the edge of the Trans-Canada with a sign that read, "A tribute to the government of Canada. Here lies the remains of what was once the Cutler acid plant, 9,000 truckloads of contaminated waste, owned and operated in consecutive eras by Noranda Mines and CIL. The plant shut down in 1963, leaving us with this great legacy. DIA, Indian Affairs, negotiated the lease on behalf of the band and settled it without including us. The people of the Serpent River Indian Band dedicate this site to them in recognition of their relentless pursuit of good on our behalf. God save the Queen." So you can imagine this sign, obviously tongue in cheek, with that indicates the anger about the situation and how very long it was left in different stages at that point. So this is in the late 1980s, 88, 89, whereas the plant had closed in 1963. And it stayed there until that time. So as a result of direct actions like that, like bringing more awareness to the site, and it was cleaned up in 1988, 89. But when I wrote my dissertation, the rocks near the arid bay were still stained orange and the smell of sulfur was still evident. So I just want to quickly move to talk about the present day, the Jikigay Historical Society. And this next story is still unfinished, so it's the shortest, but it started in 2015 and is part of my small contribution to the continuation of the troublemaking tradition in my family. Our performance art troupe is called the Jikigay Historical Society, and we are comprised of 3 Indigenous women with PhDs in history. And it came about as we tried to think of ways that we could challenge settler historical narratives about Canada. So I guess it is a very particular form of activism that is new to me, but one I have an historical skill set for. So I think it's pretty fitting. And so in 2017, as Canada celebrated its sesquicentennial anniversary, Indigenous peoples across the country felt excluded from such public displays of commemoration and celebration. And as Indigenous women, we felt that once again, our perspectives were marginalized and ignored in the historical by the historical actions of exclusively white and male political leaders were celebrated across the country. So in response to these narratives, Brittany, myself, and Kim, as well as Kimberly McLeod and Indigenous women coworkers at our respective universities, decided to stage an alternative view of Confederation at a conference at the University of Guelph in 2017. So here we are, 12 Indigenous women with roots in various places in what is now Canada, employed at 3 neighboring universities. And the performers thought ahead of time of what to wear and how to sort of harness that granny power. And we called ourselves the Grannies of Confederation, imagining what our ancestors would have looked like at the time, or asserting our own identities through the visual aspects of the performance. And so we stood, what happened was conference participants came into the room, it was a luncheon, and we stood there throughout the room refusing to speak. And we stood there stoically as grannies throughout the room, while our silence instead invited participants to reflect on why we had gathered. And after the performance, we ate together at a large table, and Go opened with the Thanksgiving address, or the words that come before all else. We feasted together as a group of performers, and then we began a discussion that included the Historical Society, Indigenous views of Canadian history, and reconciliation. And then we invited our participants to debrief and provide feedback. Afterwards, we, a very talented photographer, Tennille Campbell of Sweet Moon Photography, took this picture here of the Grannies, which is a play on the well-known painting featuring several politicians at the Charlottetown Conference, the Fathers of Confederation, done by Rex Woods in 1968 to refinish one that had been destroyed in a fire. And if you're interested, the digital story of this performance can be found in one of the links provided in the publicity for this event as well. And then our next performance was not a response to something so specific, but it was a performance actually that we wanted to do for the rivers in Guelph, in what is now Guelph. It was a way of doing something for us as women and the rivers, rather than it having be a live performance-based piece that we could then build a digital story for to share with others later on. We wanted to keep time as part of the performance, showing how different generations of Indigenous women interacted with and were responsible to water. And so my daughter, pictured here, joined us. And so Paige and I portrayed a mother and daughter at the beginning of the 20th century. Dr. Luby was a woman responsible for growing Monoman, wild rice. And Dr. Anderson portrayed a modern contemporary woman who was maintaining Indigenous protocols for water. So different time periods that we were trying to bring together, showing this continuity over time. And so this was one of the photos that we were working with. This is my daughter and I by the river. And so the use of performance art as protest or as a way of proclaiming Indigenous womanhood has been one of the stories I've been working on, and is perhaps the one that has challenged me the most. I didn't become an historian because performing was something that I was really comfortable with. And so this took me out of my comfort zone as well. And as I mentioned, it's still unfinished, this particular story, so I will leave it there, perhaps to pick it up another time. So to conclude, miigwech for taking the time out of your evening and listening to these 3 stories of Indigenous activism and resistance, detailing how women in our communities have been working on healing and moving forward. I chose them because they reflect different stages in my research journey, and they are connected to my family history and my present and my future, as I introduced my daughter to her responsibilities as well. And so more than that, I wanted to share stories of what Canadians are often unaware, stories of Indigenous women's resilience and strength that are alive in our communities, even if we have to dig in archives and newspapers to find them there too. So miigwech, and I welcome any questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lianne. That was an amazing presentation. There is a question here. When you were talking about the clubs, Peter asked whether, in current terms, were the clubs social enterprises with a limited scope?
I'm not sure what that.
Peter, do you want to clarify what you'd like to get from your question? And then anyone else, if you'd like to ask a question in the chat, I'm happy to ask Dr. Letty. Give that a second here. Getting a lot of thanks.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, Peter, go ahead.
Okay. What I was asking is, these clubs did a lot of things that are done today by social enterprises in terms of giving back to community, in terms of fundraising, in terms of doing things that are benefit to the community.
Yes, and I think here, I think the difference is that my understanding from what I can tell from the documentary evidence, and then what elders told me in my community about women generally at this time, is that in the women's work at this time, is that it's based though in a it's not really enterprising. It's not a business. It's not anything like that. It's born out of a responsibility that we are raised to have in our own communities. And I'm not trying to take anything away from social enterprises or anything like that, but my understanding of this is that it's actually rooted in Anishinaabe Kwewak's Indigenous women's responsibilities to community, and so. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think that's what I've got. Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Zoe is asking, how can we get access to these stories to incorporate with our work and teach our children?
That is a great question, because I think as academics, that's one thing I struggle with is that part of the work we are supposed to do is to publish in places, quite frankly, that are difficult for everyday folks to access. And so one of the things that I have tried to do here is, in addition to giving it back to my own community so that they can use it as they want, or reports that are more accessible, and making sure that the participants have their own interviews that they can do what they want to, is to, I've tried to publish these kinds of, not necessarily these stories, but I tried to publish in places where people can read sort of what I've written. And so Horizons magazine is one place where I've tried to write, not necessarily these historical stories, although it always loops back to history. And I think also the Jikigay Historical Society parts are accessible. So you can actually find the links, at least for that third story that I mentioned. Those are open to everybody. Those are on YouTube. If you want to access them, they are from the Sego Nichi website. It's one of the links that was in the bio piece that that I think Carolyn, and I think that was put out to publicize the talk. So that is one place where at least the third part of the story is.
We'll be happy to include some of those links in the subsequent email that will go out to all registrants as well, if you have anything else you'd like to share. Oh, sorry, my questions just jumped here. Marilyn is asking, what aspect motivated you to do your research?
That's a good question. I came to, although I put it in a different order, my research journey, it started with the story about uranium, and then moved to the Homemakers Club, and then moved to the Jikigay Historical Society. And so I think the story that I grew up with uranium was something that was incredibly important to me, that I had heard about at my grandmother's house, that she would have people come in. She was always going to meetings when I was a kid. She was a band counselor, but also a school board trustee. And so this was a story that I had grown up with. And so it was something that I wanted to learn more about, and I wanted to see what I could learn about it through this research, through more documentary research as well, and through interviews with elders. And so that's what kept me going for that piece. The Homemakers one, again, it was finding that file and having 20 other questions that I couldn't get to because I had to finish one piece before I moved into that one. But it was something that really interested me, which then also led to questions more broadly of elders in an oral history project about what life was like in the 50s and 60s for them, and what kinds of things did they remember, and pieces like that. So that sort of was shaped by the interviews themselves and what elders wanted to share, what questions they thought I should ask if I wasn't asking the right ones, things like that. So that's what has really kept me going in that one. And then the performance art, I think, really came out of actually a meeting with a colleague, Kim Anderson. She used to be my colleague here at Laurier. She's now at the University of Guelph. We saw what was happening with Canada 150, and it was really angering us in a lot of ways. We didn't see our perspectives being honored or even really acknowledged. And so that came as I think a more productive way to funnel that frustration and to call out this public history and to work to decolonize it. And then certainly as we have changed, and I've incorporated my daughter into, when she wants to, into our performances, and included her in that, I think that has also reflected a new life stage for me in my own personal life as well, which has impacted then my professional life, as I've wanted to look more at Indigenous parenthood and motherhood in particular. And so I think a lot of my work, which I think is probably similar for many Indigenous scholars and researchers, is born out of my own life experience and the changes that happen over time with that.
Thank you for sharing all that detail. Anne is asking, how are the Indigenous people of Serpent River doing today? Do they have clean water?
That is an excellent question as well. There was a new water treatment plant that was created in the last probably 5 years. And so there have been challenges back and forth with that as well. Certainly when I was still writing my dissertation, there was still a boil water advisory there. It's challenging because there are different wells in different parts of the community. And so that can have an impact then on the health of the water. This is actually serendipitous, and part of the reason why I incorporated it in here was I think because of COVID, there's been some interest on the part of some students in the community who want to know more about that history. And so my aunt asked, can you send your dissertation? And I said, of course. Do you want me to send something a little bit shorter that might be more accessible to people? And so I think that has been really interesting for people in the community who want to know more about that history and to be able to position that in what's going on right now as well. So I think our communities are resilient, and I think as a future generation becomes more interested in this history, I think as we can move forward together.
Absolutely. Niru first commented how she loved hearing about the way your grandmother's influenced you and how there's this passing along through the generations, which I hear a lot about. So Niru is asking, what is next in your research that builds on the stories, and what impact will these stories have on future communities? And are your stories now being used in the community at large?
So if some of these stories are, and I try to make sure that they are accessible to people, whoever wants these stories, especially in our particular community. It's part of being accountable to community. And so, like I mentioned, I provided I wrote up a quick report for students who wanted to know more about it, and more, so they didn't have to read the 300 pages. And I also provided that similar information to another elders group in the community that's concerned about a quarry that's being proposed on the territory. And so they wanted, again, another kind of report that they could submit and read and then reinforce with their own stories. And so I've tried to do things like that to make sure that not only providing the actual published, or in the case of the dissertation, the bound copy and the interviews and things like that, but try to also make sure that there's accessible things that people can use if they would find that helpful for whatever reason they need to have that. What's next for me? I have been again interested in family history, and so one of the things actually, when my daughter was born, my partner, who is also an historian at Laurier, was looking into our respective family histories and found that there were a lot of our relatives were in the same places along the St. Lawrence and into the Great Lakes area at the same time, but not really interacting with each other. His family is, that part of his family is French Canadian. And so we're looking at sort of how those waterways work together, and how sometimes they're tied to fur trade and so on. And I'm really interested in what kinds of things that we can uncover about Indigenous women at that much earlier period as well. So, what did their lives look like? How many children did they have? What kinds of work were they doing? And that. So that's at the very beginning. I have no idea the answers to those questions, but that's sort of where I'm going there. And again, it comes out of my own family history and the birth of my daughter.
Suda is asking about what a word means, and I know I'm going to mispronounce it, even though you said it so beautifully. She's asking, what does Jikigay mean?
Oh, right. I was running out of time, so I skipped part of it. So Jikigay is the name of our society, and I will read Elder Renee Mishake's exact words for So when we brought our performance troupe together, we didn't have a name. And so we wanted to have a name in the right way. And so Kim offered Sema or tobacco to Renee Mashake, who's an Anishinaabe elder in Guelph. And he remembered the story of his father, actually, who used to be a trailblazer for the Ministry of Natural Resources. And so he gave us the name of Jikigay. It's in the present tense. It means making marks on a tree by chipping off a piece of the bark, like blazing a trail for students and travelers. I can see clearly that that's what you're doing in the academic world. So it's actually a really beautiful name and a really meaningful name. And so thank you so much for asking that question and allowing me to be able to answer that and to share Renee's words with you.
That's really beautiful. So Bill has, and anyone who's still here in the room, we will go a little bit over, so thank you for staying to answer some of these questions as well, Dr. Letty. Bill is asking, Indigenous Services Canada has a budget of over $9 billion. In your view, what are the ways that these funds can be better spent to assist First Nations people?
I think in a time where recently Minister Miller announced that they were not going to be able to meet the water, or to end boil water advisories, there was a deadline of 2021, and he just announced, I think it was in the last week, that deadline was going to, they weren't going to be able to meet it. And so I see things like that are so central to life, and that so many people take for granted, like clean water, that needs to be addressed in very meaningful ways. I would also like to see more involvement at the community level about what that looks like in terms of what those needs are, and I think it really comes down to being able to make sure that a lot of the gaps that we see between Indigenous communities and the rest of Canada are addressed. And so, but I think it starts with water, and I think it starts with access to safe places for learning. Schools are another area where there is a huge disparity in funding. Child welfare, there are huge disparities in funding. And a lot of what my own research, because a lot of it had to do with land, you can see my grandmother used to call it like we were just like a football being passed around. So when you have jurisdictional issues between the province and between the federal government, that say things like, well, healthcare is a provincial responsibility, but status Indians registered under the Indian Act, and increasingly the courts have determined Indigenous peoples are a federal responsibility. What does that look like, and can we stop that kind of jurisdictional arguing about that, so that we can actually address these issues without tossing the football?
So frustrating, that back and forth. Carolyn is asking, she said she was familiar with women's institutes called Homemakers clubs in places like Saskatchewan, but not Indigenous Homemakers clubs. They had the same tagline for Home and Country, and she's asking, were the Indigenous Homemakers clubs modeled on them?
I wouldn't be surprised if they were. I don't know, but yeah, I have heard that the women's institutes have very similar sort of taglines and constitutions and things like that. I don't know the answer to your question, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case.
So he's asking a great question about self-learning, and I would like to promote, I've been working through this course myself. It's the Indigenous Canada course through University of Alberta. It's offered for free on Coursera, which I think is just one of the best places to start for learning that basic history at first. But she's asking, are there any must understand first to ground our understanding, or any books that you would suggest for self-learning?
I think Thomas King's The Inconvenient Indian is a place that you can take a look. But I think, like you mentioned, that course at the University of Alberta is I've been hearing excellent things about it. I had not done it myself, but I think that increasingly there are resources that are available, even just web-based resources that you can access to be able to have a grounding of this. But in terms of books, I would do, an Inconvenient Indian. If you wanted to invest, they are expensive, but different, there's, where is it? I'll give a plug to this book here. If you ask a historian about a book, she's going to tell you.
Absolutely.
There is, it's a history. It's called Indigenous Peoples within Canada, a concise history. So as I mentioned, it's a textbook, so it is pricey, but it is a good place to get started if you're interested about Indigenous peoples in what is now Canada.
Thank you. Are you still okay, Dr. Letty, for a few more questions?
Yes.
Yes,
Yep.
great. JB is asking, how could Indigenous voices have been represented better in Canada 150? Or at all?
Yeah, and I think the key about Canada 150 is that it commemorates a milestone that was a part of our continued colonization. And so I think the Canada 150 itself is a challenge for us to be able to, like, it's not just a question of like, well, if there had been, some more gatherings that for Indigenous peoples, then it would have been okay. Like it's not necessarily the exclusion from different events. It's the fact that the very anniversary itself is something that stings. And so I think that's where the disconnect is, that it's a commemoration of Confederation, that, the British North America Act that is where, Indians and lands reserved for Indians become the purview of the federal government, as just one example. And so it's a consolidation of a nation state that is built on Indigenous lands and the theft of Indigenous lands. And so that is something that is difficult then to celebrate at all.
I think that could be an entire talk in and of itself,
Yeah.
for sure, or multi-day talk. Ruth is asking, is there any link for any future Historical Society talks or performances that might be happening that you would recommend, or and she says she's hoping these stories are more represented in documentaries and movies as well, moving forward.
Yeah, our society doesn't have anything planned right now. It tends to be once every 2 years or so is sort of how we get together, because it takes a while then to do the digital story and so on. We're also three women who have other research projects as well. So for us to get together and to be able to think of what's going on, and sometimes it's also organic. It's in response to something, or it's one of us has an idea or something like that. So they're not really at regular intervals or anything. But you're welcome to check out the links that will be provided to you that can show you some of our past works.
That's great. Yeah, we'll be happy to include those in the follow-up email. We are on our final question, and we've had some beautiful thank yous on here as well, and you'll be able to see those in the text that I send you. Phyllis is asking and stating, Dr. Letty, your stories reveal such clever ways that Indigenous women have shown effective resistance of differing oppressive systems. The resistance is serious, but humor emerged through some of your stories. Is there a relationship between humor and Indigenous women's resistance or persistence? Miigwech.
Yes, Miigwech, that's an excellent question. It is yes, that Indigenous humor is something that is becoming increasingly actually well documented. Writers like Drew Hayden Taylor, who's Anishinaabe from Curve Lake, he has written about Indigenous humor in that way. I think I mentioned Tom King too, who, although he writes about really serious topics, often uses some humor in his work as well. And so, yes, there's definitely a tie between humor and this. And I think even when these situations are very troubling, and they're very, you know, they can be really devastating in terms of if you use the uranium example. And still, yet there's a lot of humor when I'm transcribing my interviews, because I transcribe them myself. There's a lot of laughter in there, and I think it speaks to Indigenous resilience, and also just that I think there's a stereotype that we're so stoic, but really we're pretty funny people. Yeah. So.
I love that. Thank you everyone who stayed on to hear all these fabulous responses from Dr. Letty. We'd like to say on behalf of Wilfrid Laurier University, the town of Milton, and the Milton Public Library, thank you, Dr. Letty, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us this evening. Thank you also to all the attendees for joining us. And a copy of tonight's lecture will be shared on the Milton Public Library website in the next few days, and will be included in a follow-up email coming within the next week. We would also like to invite everyone to attend Milton Public Library's One Book, One Milton author conversation on January 11th with CBC Canada Reads winner Samra Habib for the book We Have Always Been Here. We will be joined with CBC's Michael Serapio, and registration information will be available on the follow-up email as well. And our next Laurier lecture will be on January 13th, and we're excited to announce that we'll be using a new platform called Crowdcast beginning in 2021, and further information will be included in the follow-up email as well. Thank you all, and have a lovely night.
Thanks, everybody. See you in the new year.